it is through a food lens. And what's so interesting and amazing is that so many separate things actually are related to each other when you look at them through a food lens. So I've been at this for decades now, so I think I've learned through a food lens. And the good news is that when I started all this, people thought it was a bit weird, but they made fun of me. They used to give me, talk about wheat, that's how I started, or give me carrot sticks at parties. But now it's really popular, and for good reason, and not just in academic circles. Food is an issue that's probably brought a lot of you out here.
Harriet, we're having difficulty hearing you.
Oh, okay, I'll try
That's fine.
to project from the diaphragm. Okay. This phrase, feeding the world, is probably very familiar to you. It's everywhere. What does it mean? What does it mean? Who's supposed to do the feeding? What is it to feed, and feed whom? And what is food anyway? So, I'm not going to be able to answer all those questions, but I'm going to deconstruct this a little bit, really following an article from someone from the British Soil Association named Tomlinson, who went through some of these reports where this term, feeding the world, came about. And it came about in a way that's very different from the way it's mainly used now. So I will just go through that a little bit and then move on from there. The general line that's repeated a lot: we must double global food production to feed the world of 9 billion by 2050. These become iconic numbers. They're all projections and models, and I actually don't know anything about the future, but I am skeptical about people who claim that they do. So if we just look at, sometimes they say 70% is all we need, and sometimes they say 9.5 billion, but basically this is how it goes, and it seems to be, if you repeat it often enough, the first law of propaganda is just repeat it, and then everyone knows it's true, and certain things come with it that people know to be true, whether they are or not. So this is true even though another commonly accepted and repeated fact, though less publicly known, is the Millennium Development Goals adopted by most countries at the UN included among one of their main priorities to have the number of hungry people by 2015. That was done at the turn of the millennium, and that goal has been receding, particularly since the crises of 2008, which have not stabilized prices and which don't promise to let them go down again. So it's not even quite internally consistent with widely known, widely agreed facts. So what is it? It's a discourse. It's a way of compacting a lot of implicit meanings into a statement, and in this case also a mandate that we have to do certain things in order to solve this problem. So it's a definition of the problem, carries a definition of the problem, and an implied solution. So where did it come from, this idea of feeding the world, which is really different from food security, it's different from the right to food, it's different from a whole lot of, it's different from hunger, question of hunger. Feeding the world. In 2003, that's not listed here, there was a report that is available by the Food and Agriculture Organization, which really was very gloomy about the prospects of feeding the world, because, well, I'll get to that in a moment, but in 2006, a report that is not available publicly now, called World Agriculture Towards 2030 or 2050, sometimes the goal is divided in half at 2030. But that report was based on the 2003 report, but it shifted the discourse quite a bit. Now it was, instead of, it's difficult to see how, with diets continuing the way they are, with diets changing as income levels increase, particularly in among new populations, middle classes in Asia and elsewhere, that with diet staying constant and without the ability, or well, to increase the amount of food produced, I'll get to what food means in a minute, would mean impinging on ecosystems in a way that simply is not sustainable. I'm not going to, that's a multi-meaning word, but it's not able to support this diet or anything else in a long run. Now, the term feeding the world as we must do it, with a lot of implications, came from Jacques Diouf, the director of the FAO, when he was addressing a high-level conference on food security in 2008, which you will recognize possibly as the year that's often called a world food crisis. There have been a series of them now when grain prices shot way up. And there were riots, and there was a lot of hungry people. So lying behind all of this is not necessarily a question of compassion, but a lot of fear, like what's going to happen with instability. We already see resource wars and so on. So this early paper from the Food and Agriculture Organization was not trying to project something that was desirable, but something that was most likely. And it concluded that the Millennium Development Goal was not likely to be met, and that wetlands, forests, and other ecologically sensitive areas were going to be impinged upon. And the point of the model was to just show people this dangerous trajectory we're on and to try to help people cope. So, how did this become We Feed the World? And more importantly, what is the agenda? Because when it starts getting repeated a lot, there's some powerful voices that are leading to this repetition, and there's some agenda that comes with it, and it's important to look at it. First, there's going to be more land needed to grow this food, in addition to the phrase that's often called an oxymoron, sustainable intensification. It's used a lot. More land used more intensively, the very particular definition of that means more technology, more in particular proprietorial technology, more improved seeds that can be drought resistant, that can deal with climate change, that can be less water using because we're going to run out of water. And in general, this got encapsulated in the Gates Project for a second green revolution, particularly in Africa. This one, we should note, is really different from the first green revolution, which was done in the public sector. It was an intergovernmental agency, which still exists, the CGIAR. I can tell you what it means if you want, but it was the one that brought you the first green revolution and high-yielding varieties. All of that was in the public domain, and all of it was intended to help farmers improve their production of particular grains that were investigated and improved. The second green revolution is proprietorial, and it goes with a very particular agenda to do with intellectual property, which is a new feature for seeds and even life forms of the last less than 20 years. It goes with agenda of widening markets, which is a trade and investment agenda. Sorry, I didn't have time to do my editing, close the parenthesis there. And a deepening of markets, meaning an involvement of finance and financial investment in a way that has not been the case before. That food and agriculture have been a site of accumulation, direct accumulation for capital, in a way that has never been the case before. This is at a time when the whole economy has been shifted toward finance. I'm just going to assume you kind of know what that means. I can go into, I'll give a few examples in a minute, but some of the creative financial instruments that have been developed have brought finance directly into commodities markets and have changed the nature of commodity trading in a way that makes it extremely difficult to stabilize prices, which was the old function. It has also been directly investing in land. before, it was really important to most development changes in the world or national or regional economies of food to allow farmers to take the risk. But capital is willing to take it directly now. It's investing directly in farmland in something that's become highly contentious and is not well documented. The other thing that's happened here with privatization is the kind of data we need are not being collected. So predictions about the future are extremely problematic. Okay, so their prior ideological commitments, this is still following Tomlinson. I'll depart from her after this slide, I think, maybe the one after. The ideological commitments are to a particular understanding of growth as measured in monetary terms by GDP, which means if the price of food goes up, growth goes up. It doesn't even matter if more food is being produced. It certainly doesn't matter who it's getting to. Trade is really important. So the idea, the agenda has been for almost, well, virtually every government. I can think of a few exceptions that are partial, but for virtually every government, as well as the World Trade Organization, which was agreed in 1995, the important way to improve agriculture is to increase exports, and the important way to improve food security is to remove barriers to imports. The definition of the problem is that there's not enough production. The three criteria that have been the consistent criteria for food security have been sufficient supply, access, and distribution. So hungry people need to be able to get access to food. And then there's some more qualifiers that happen sometimes. But those fall into the wayside here, and the problem is defined as getting production up. Consumer sovereignty is an absolute ideological commitment. The idea that we could change diets, the idea that diets are themselves in part constructed out of the incentives from the rules that govern markets right now, that's not something that's easy to consider. So the idea is that we just project, we know empirically what people eat as their incomes go up, which is particularly more meat, and that the ratio varies from 3:1 to 8:1, depending on the animal, of how much grain is cycled through an animal to turn into human food. So there are various other studies that try to estimate and model what it would mean, and many of them come up with the idea that we could feed 9 billion people right now if we distributed it properly and if we had more modest diets. But this consumer sovereignty is not a question. We're going to need all of this grain, more than half of which now, by the way, and certainly more of the soybeans, at least outside of Asia, go to feed animals, then go to feed humans, and more of that through subsidies. These are not natural markets, are going to feed cars and airplanes now through biofuels. So consumer sovereignty changing of diets cannot be entered into this kind of conception. And this issue is completely how we're going to feed 9 billion people by 2050 is not considered in relation to climate change, energy, the scarcity of certain crucial inputs to industrial farming, fossil fuels, but also phosphates as fertilizers, the loss of biodiversity, post-harvest waste, which is now becoming a big issue and is estimated sometimes. They do archaeological digs, to see what's been lost, cores through waste landfills, that it's estimated to be up to 40%. Who knows, because there's no global figures on this. It doesn't take into account equity, health, or the kinds of conflicts that people in this room are probably interested in that come out of the challenges to resources, from pressure on water, loss of soil, pressure on all kinds of ways, of things that we'll need to produce, anyone needs, any farmer needs, to produce food, in addition to just simple space. So all of these things are not part of the story of we need to feed 9 billion people by 2050. There have been other models, though, and these are really interesting to think about. No model is going to be better than any other model in a certain way, but if we realize that multiple models lead us to different conclusions, then we can hold a different kind of skepticism and ask different kinds of questions about what kind of future we might want to aim toward and what might be the best ways of moving toward them. One of the most important, the French government's been carrying a really interesting set of research agendas in what's probably the biggest public sector research facility, I don't know about China, but certainly in my knowledge in the Western world. And two organizations in particular, the National Institute of Agronomic Research in Rabat and CIRAD, where I just spent 5 months working, which is the one that has in the past been devoted to the Global South, but they're all working together now. They did some models they called Agri-Monde, agricultural world, and they did growth projections depending on different assumptions. So one of them was the straight growth projections that the FAO and the other, FAO's done other reports, by the way, but this particular FAO report that became the origin of the Feeding the World story. And they did another model that focused on health, equity, and environment and asked about changing incentives to produce, distribute, and consume in a different way, which would lead to convergent diets measured quantitatively. We're not talking about everyone eating the same food. The first one pretty well is. Across regions and classes. So with more equity, they conclude it certainly is possible to create a better system focusing on attention to the environment and healthy diets. So one of the things that's really important to notice as a kind of counter trend here is that in 2003, the World Health Organization announced a global obesity crisis. And of course, obesity is all over the news now. And when I was chair of the Toronto Food Policy Council in the 1990s, and we were trying to get Toronto Public Health to allow us to use certain data and to make certain arguments about the relationship between diet and chronic disease, and all we wanted to talk about was heart disease and diabetes. No, you couldn't prove that, we couldn't say that. Well, I mean, now it's another piece of common sense. What I'd like to point out is that it's common sense that is actually in contradiction with at least the consumer sovereignty idea, and I would say with more of the ideas that have to do with the naturalness of markets in that Feeding the World story. In particular, that we have diets that are overly concentrated in what nutritionists are now calling empty calories, which is processed foods, but also in fat, sugars, and salts, and too heavily probably in meat. That's contentious. Nor am I arguing, or any of these people arguing for vegetarianism. I'll just say right now, it is actually part of every sustainable farming system to use animals in one way or another, and if we use them, we're probably going to eat them. It's just that there are going to be many fewer of them, and the relative prices will be quite different. So that's a little aside there. So we're not talking about anything extreme here. We're just talking about something that I will talk more about, what is a sustainable farming system. But there was another study of multiple scenarios by Friends of the Earth and Compassion in World Farming, and I should also add here about data, that most of our data now is coming from non-governmental organizations. The governments and the intergovernmental agencies are simply not collecting the kinds of data we need to ask and to answer these questions. They're collecting the kinds of data that got defined basically by the UN, at least at the UN, mostly got defined in 1946 and 7 and 8 when these various agencies were established and set their routines in. At that point, certain things were generally agreed, like getting production up, grains and proteins were the important thing we needed. We didn't need to worry about micronutrients. So the obesity crisis now, or what the nutrition transition it's sometimes called, means that fruits and vegetables that used to be easily available to anybody, even to poor people. They would have an apple tree around, farmers around, even if they couldn't sell their stuff, there would be fruits and vegetables, horticultural crops. available. What we did with the car, fossil fuels changed a lot of things, was pave over all of that land that was closest to cities. I'll talk about that more in a minute too. And what happened is that fruits and vegetables started to become expensive, while processed foods and meat using highly subsidized feed grains came to be cheap. So we had a structured market, and we still do, in which the incentives to eat and to grow and to trade in certain ways seem to be natural, but they're not. So we have these multiple scenarios now that are done using the best data they can come up with to create different models, and they have different models. That low chemical, knowledge intensive farming can feed 9 billion people at modest diets and with low inequality or greater equity. Now, one of the most important and least known, outside of specialized circles, reports that was done, and I was lucky enough to work on this, was the International Assessment of Agricultural Knowledge, Science, and Technology for Development. The K is missing. That was a very important political achievement in the middle of this 5-year process, was to get knowledge put in, because science and technology started off meaning, at least for some of the players, biotechnology, industrial farming, big scale stuff. And by the way, I'm not necessarily opposed to biotechnology either. We can talk about that. It's how it's done, it's who owns it, it's the farming system that is the crucial question. This ISTAD report came out of a series of reports. It started with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, went through some other ones to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2003, I believe, which then concluded, on the basis of the best available scientific analysis, that farming and the food system were responsible for a great deal of climate change. And obviously, if you think about it, farming and food and the use of the land in general are what has the most potential to sequester carbon. It has the most potential to help us live in a carbon neutral or even a carbon positive way if we can use sunlight directly. So the Millennium Ecosystem said it really matters a lot what kind of farming system we have. The next project was the ISTAD project, which was actually housed at the World Bank at that time, but it was an intergovernmental called UN-led report. It had industry, the crop protection industry, which you might remember as the pesticide industry. It's actually the life science industry now, part of it, along with Big Pharma and a whole lot of other things. They were there, and so were some NGOs. In particular, the most active was Pesticide Action Network in leading the other civil society organizations. The mandate of this report was to find the best possible evaluation of scientific evidence. What do we know, what do we not know, what's in dispute, and what needs to be discovered with respect to 3 criteria. What is the best kind of science and technology, later knowledge as well, to do 3 things at once: improve food security, and manage environment sustainably, and improve rural livelihoods. The rural livelihoods is really crucial, and that's coming back in another way, which I will talk about more. But so far we've been talking mainly about food security and environmental sustainability. And the answer to that was that if you want to increase biodiversity, improve greenhouse gases, the general state of the climate, manage water flows, improve soil, and retain and build up soil, then the best thing you can do is to support farmers. This is where the knowledge comes in. To support farmers who've already been doing this for thousands of years, who've been helping crops adapt to changing climate and to changing demand in their own regions, to help them do this with science, to create a partnership instead of an opposition between science, formal science, and practical knowledge. that was the conclusion. This report started being attacked before it was even released, and that is why you've never heard of it. So somebody is promoting the Feeding the World agenda, and maybe somebody similar, I don't know, there were a whole series of things. Jacques Diouf, the same director of the FAO, came out just before it was released, the ISTAD report. The FAO was a big player in writing this report. Came out and said, we need a report on agricultural knowledge, science, not knowledge, sorry, agricultural science and technology. Oh, excuse me, Jacques, you know, we've got one. It's coming out. Scientists from all over the world have worked on it for 5 years. There were many, many things like this. The attack that it was not scientific came because new kinds of science were brought in the middle. And that was part of what I was there for as a sociologist. There were geographers, sociologists, anthropologists. Most importantly, there were agronomists and ecologists, entomologists. There were the people who look at agriculture as a system, and a social system and a natural system. And these are the people who were then declaimed as non-scientific by the first people who were there, which were the conventional crop scientists, who by now were mainly working for private industry, or whose agenda, even in the public sector, was set by private industry. So a certain kind of technology was being developed that was mainly biochemical and laboratory-based science that could be patented by then, and agricultural economists who were completely bought into the natural markets and the trade agenda. So basically this argument, this ISTAD report, focused on the fact in the language, it did use this language, it was developed by the EU for other reasons, and we can talk about the complexity of that. But the point is, it's generally important to understand that agriculture has multiple functions. It's not just about producing food. It is about managing ecosystems. Farmers have known this for a very long time when they talk about themselves as stewards of the land. This is somehow almost lost, although sometimes it gets revived in other ways, like using fewer chemicals with more precision and a variety of things with different seeds. So the idea is that good farming is integrated into ecosystems, and good farming supports farmers. It values farmland and farmers and knowledge, and it supports them with science, land, and appropriate kinds of markets. Another bright light in this world is Olivier de Schutter, the special rapporteur on the right to food of the UN. And I put his website there because if you do nothing else after this lecture, just going on his website and reading his various reports would be useful. Let me just see how many people have been paying attention to what's been going on in Canada. Have people heard of Olivier de Schutter? Okay, those who have, do you know about his report to Canada? Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah, okay, so he came to Canada, the first OECD country to have a country visit. His reports are often on themes, and in particular, this line I have here, where he redefines the right to food to include many things, but to include the right to a healthy agro-ecosystem, or a sustainable agro-ecosystem. Okay, so those are themes, but he also does country visits to assess the accomplishments or failures of governments with respect to ensuring the right to food, to which most, including Canada, have signed on. This is part of the UN Declaration on Universal Rights. Human rights.
Yeah.
And then it's been updated a few times. And the idea is that, of course, you can't expect governments to ensure the right to healthy, adequate, and other things have been added, culturally appropriate food, but you can expect them to have a progressive realization of this right, that is, move in the right direction. And he came to Canada, and he saw that in a lot of cases, not only in Canada, but this is what he was looking at, it's been moving the other way. There are, in fact, more hungry people now than there were at some period in time. I'm not sure when the starting point is, but for some years now, at least more than a decade, it's been moving backwards, and in particular, certain populations, and he singled out Aboriginal populations, are in a desperate state that compares unfavorably to many parts of the world. Now, oh yes. So, I'm not sure why I put this here. I didn't have time to revise this because it was 5:45 when I realized that I had to stop working on this and come over here. But Via Campesina was formed in reaction to the trade agenda that was carried by the World Trade Organization. It formed in the early 90s, just when the Uruguay round was reaching its completion, which would culminate in 1994, and then implemented in 1995 the World Trade Organization, and with it the Agreement on Agriculture. Now, it's really important to understand that agriculture has always been treated separately by governments. It's always been treated separately by international organizations that are trying now to make it part of the general picture. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade explicitly, it only has 12 or 13, does anyone know, 12 or 13 articles. Unlike the World Trade Organization, it's pretty short. You can actually read the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And Article 11, I think it was, explicitly said nothing about this commitment to move toward freer trade applies to agriculture. Agriculture is not part of this agreement. Everywhere else, if you think about it, agricultural laborers are excluded from minimum wage laws. One thing after another, agriculture is different from any other economic sector. And one of the main goals of the Uruguay round of the GATT, of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which resulted in the World Trade Organization, was to create an agreement on agriculture, to change that. And they did create an agreement on agriculture of a sort, and I recommend that all of you just go online and take a look at it. Because, well, first place, it's huge, it's so complicated, you can't make any sense of it, like the whole WTO. But, well, lawyers get to argue about it in great teams and great meetings in Geneva and everywhere. But in addition to that, there are all of these boxes, and there are parentheses of things not yet agreed. And in Cancun, where the World Trade Organization stopped moving forward, was when the countries of the Global South said in 2003, I think, who remembers exactly? No, if northern countries don't liberalize your markets, we're going to stop. It's already too late for their agriculture. They're already on an export agenda and a whole bunch of things, and intellectual properties already agreed, but we will not agree to trade and services, and we will not agree to free trade and investment. Now that's being done in bilateral agreements. That's why that's gone that way. So it's not been a great success, but that was the aim, and it is still the great momentum in the power of the world economy, and it is part of this Feeding the World agenda. Or this Feeding the World agenda, I think, is carrying this project, among other things. It's carrying it ideologically. That it's needed in order to either feed people because we care about them, or feed people because we're scared we're going to have rebellions, or we're scared of migration that is happening massively and uncontrollably because of a lot of the reorganizations of food system, and in particular of land and small farmers in the Global South. So Via Campesina, they got all this. I mean, it had already been happening through debt collection and structural adjustment policies in the 1980s, and they said, these groups of national farmers got together to form Via Campesina, which was an international movement of farmers' organizations. It is the largest social movement in the world. It's not clear how coherent it is. It's not clear anything about it, except that it is pretty big. And it has an idea of food sovereignty, which is really different. That peoples, not very clearly defined, peoples have the right to feed themselves and to decide how they will be fed. And it is farmer-led, So it tends to mean that farmers are going to be the main ones to define this, which is a very different perspective, I think you can see. It's also important that many of these farmers, if you look at Latin America, Asia, and so on, they're indigenous. And indigenous peoples have been organizing internationally already for a long time. And they have been challenging intellectual property claims, so what's often called biopiracy. So if corporations go in and take basmati rice from India or take a medicinal plant from the Amazon and then patent it, then often there can be a challenge there. It's tricky, and lawyers, many of whom do this for pro bono, represent these organizations. And then the Convention on Biodiversity in 1992, as part of the Rio Agreements, gave governments the right to do this, to control the flow of genetic materials, or to make claims to income on their basis. But the Convention on Biodiversity is in serious conflict with the trade-related intellectual property agreement, which so far is trumping it. And you don't hear much about the Convention on Biodiversity. But it's there. It's there. And there's some really important provisions, and they are being developed. So, okay, indigenous people, many are not small farmers, campesinos. That's an interesting discourse in itself. Many are landless, and one of the biggest members of Via Campesina, and what is the landless workers movement in Brazil, but they want land, and they claim land, and they occupy land, and they have been an important part of getting the Brazilian government elected and in keeping it honest around some of these policies. They have not joined the government. And it's important to note, too, that Brazil is one of the rare countries in the world. It's not only an emerging country and all of that, it's also reduced inequality. It's one of the rare countries in the world, and it's done that through a series of innovative kinds of public sector transfers. Okay, and the discourse of campesinos is extremely important because it is a reclaiming. Nettie Weave of the National Farmers Union of Canada, who's one of the founding members of Via Campesina, says it means people of the field, people of the land. It doesn't mean anything bad like peasants, but it is a reclaiming of a kind of dignity for farmers, including traditional farmers, including indigenous farmers, including women farmers, that has been in serious dispute and has not been dominant throughout history, though it's waxed and waned. And they are the ones who came up, not immediately, but eventually, with the idea of food sovereignty. So, the alternative, starting with the land, starting with the farmers, could be something, however vague the word may be, that we could call ecological food systems that would start with farming, would start with using the land. So let me just step back a minute and do a little evolution of food and agriculture. Once upon a time, in the agricultural revolution, thought to have happened in various places between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago, the great culinary and agronomic complexes that we know today, that almost are a great part of what define the cultures of the world, were created. And they were created in a way that included maize, beans, and squash, plus peppers and a lot of wild plants everywhere. But the three in Mexico included rice and fish and soybeans. In many parts of Asia, it included wheat, barley, olives, vines, lentils in the Middle East. Millet, there are different complexes that always have, or in the Andes, potatoes. They always have a starchy staple, which is either a root crop or a grain. That was an important part of domestication. They have a wide variety of other crops that give all those micronutrients, fruits and vegetables, leaves, herbs, some wild, those are tricky words, some wild, some domesticated, animals as a secondary part. These then gave flavor and constrained our biological urges for unlimited amounts of salt, sugar, and fat, which come to the fore when these cuisines are suppressed. So the food companies come and they take people who have lost a food culture or not particularly attached to it, and they do focus groups, and they find out we like salt, sugar, and fat, and that's what they give us, and there's consumer sovereignty for you. So what we need to do is use our big brains, as Kurt Vonnegut would say, to think our way out of this dilemma that we become deracinated, uprooted in literal and metaphorical ways from the growing of food and the eating of the food in relation to what's grown. Again, I'm not making an extreme localism argument, I'm just talking about a relationship here, reconstructing relationships. Now the EU, the European Union, says that in its definition of multifunctionality that agriculture is supposed to provide not only food, but feed for animals, fiber, cotton, linen, all of that, and fuel. So there's a lot of upset about biofuels, and a lot of it is very well placed. There's a lot of upset about animal feeds, and a lot of it's well placed. However, if we're going to go to an ecological farming system that's not reliant on fossil fuels, which is dead energy from our ancestors that have been buried under the ground and who are running out, if we're not going to depend on that, then we're going to have to get everything from the sun. And a lot of that will come through the plants and the animals and ourselves eating that. And that includes working with the water, the wind, the waves, the air currents, all the things, the climate, and the cycles of natural processes that actually support life on Earth. They support life in each ecosystem, and they support us as we now have to understand ourselves as a human species sharing this planet where all the ecosystems are related into the biosphere. And things move at different rates. Air moves faster than water, which moves faster than soil, but it's all moving. The carbon's moving, the nitrogen's moving. It's moving through our bodies. It's moving through everything we eat. The water is moving through our bodies and through everything we eat and through all the other beings who we have to share this planet with. So we have to do that somehow in an increasingly urban world, and a world that has a big problem, which is also potentially a big solution, which is a lot of unemployed, educated young people everywhere in the world. Some of whom, ta-da, want to farm. And doesn't have to be very many either, right? Okay, I do a whole other lecture on this, on Southern Ontario and who wants to farm here, because we're getting to a question now of a world that is now more than half urban. Of course, that's highly uneven across the world. But it's also true that people who are now being evicted for large-scale agriculture through massive land purchases and transformation of land use in especially Africa, but other parts of the world as well, including Ontario, go there, the people who are being evicted from land in Mali are now not going where they used to go if they left the land, which is to a local town and maybe to Bamako. People aren't moving. Well, people are or aren't moving in Mali in a new way now, but that's all part of this story too. We can talk about that. I just came back from France. It was really interesting and scary what's going on in the world right now. So, okay, but what they do is they'll go to Paris. And they might keep their connections. They might even be able to help somebody stay on the land back in the village by working in Paris or having a cousin in New York. So these kinds of migratory moves now are turning us into a single kind of culture, but not a uniform one. And what we need to do is put it together that instead of expelling people from the land, and here the ISTAD report was visionary, instead of expelling people from the land, we should be giving them good reasons to stay on it. And what may be the most positive thing about Via Campesina is its revaluing of the idea of farming. That farmers are important. Farmers feed cities. farmers live in cities. Some of them are in this room. So where food is grown, how it's grown, and by whom becomes the starting point for understanding how we can re-embed our food system. So instead of evicting people from the land, these are all pictures from Brazil. I really was careful about where I took these images from. So on any single slide now, they're going to be at least from one country. So however implicit and sketchy the relationships are, this is also true. That people are being evicted for large-scale soy production, which you can see up there. That's people-less farming, fossil fuel dependent, export agriculture. Most of it now goes to China. Those people being evicted from the land for that, where do they go? Well, they might go to come to Toronto. We've got a large Brazilian population here, but they also probably go here. This is called the City of God. It's a slum in Rio de Janeiro. Now, I know Meta's particularly partial to Doug Saunders' idea that coming to cities is going to improve everybody's life, but one of my colleagues at CERAD is doing research on, he's doing some more different kinds of projections on what would happen if, say, everybody in India moved to cities. And I said, what would happen? He said, well, I haven't calculated, but the buildings would have to be many kilometers high, right? And the government knows that. So they have this holding action, which is a minimum wage for agricultural laborers in the off-season to try to keep them from leaving the countryside, just minimal. So do we evict people in order to have that kind of farming and have them come to cities that arguably cannot accommodate them and certainly offer them jobs at this point? Or, there, do we have knowledge intensive, that is labor intensive, but skilled labor intensive, knowledge intensive, participatory certification of ecological farming? There's a lot in that phrase, and the participatory certification is one of the most exciting things. All of this is about being modern. It's not about being backward at all. So these are also from Brazil. I decided to stick with Brazil, especially because they've got this amazing thing. Do you know about this, Lorraine? Ecovita? They have, okay, so they're doing permaculture, highly intensive, as a permaculture pear farm. This is, tell us what this is. This is where you put the stuff on to renew the soil.
Right, mulching.
Mulching, this is mulching, yes, that's a really big technical term. And what permaculture does is it works with the land and with the natural processes to try to get, maximize the kinds of foods that are wanted. And they're amazing. We don't know what can be done. I'm gonna come back to that. So we're not predicting who or what can feed the world. What we do need to do is think about what's the best direction to move forward. Ecovita is very exciting, and Brazil is one of the places that is innovating in every regard. So yes, they've got those giant export operations going, and they're drilling, doing deep sea drilling of oil now, but they also have a second, in addition to the agriculture ministry, they have a second ministry of agricultural reform, which helps this regional food system based on food staples and local farmers and urban regions to help all that prosper, to create the market incentives that will help it prosper. And one of the things it's just done is it's passed the first law in the world that permits, enables participatory certification. So instead of the supermarkets coming in, I haven't even talked about how that happened, but I can if you want. 1990s is when that started happening. Fruits and vegetables started getting organized in big supply chains. I think I have a slide about that coming up. But instead of having supermarket standards that favor one type of food that then will go in a supply chain to a supermarket, whether it's in the same country or a different country, for people with enough money to buy it, so that that land and those food, that mangoes, those coconuts, whatever it is, are no longer available in that easy way that they were before, which is why people are running out of micronutrients. There's something called participatory certification. where farmers define their own criteria of ecology, ecological production, and have very interesting, absolutely unprecedented ways of organizing from below to be able to create those trust relations and to sustain them and to increase their scale by networking, by scaling out rather than scaling up. So instead of a hierarchy, they can create products that can be trusted to be ecologically grown across the whole country, and certainly within their region, which is the focus in each region. And I can't get into it now, and I would love to study it because I don't even really understand it. It's too new, but it's very exciting, and it comes out of ecological farming and a need to be able to trade beyond the beyond the immediate relationships. So, do we want food crops or export crops? So the whole focus has been on export crops. This is all Kenya now, and I put the flowers in there because it makes the point more dramatically. But it's also true that if you have a field of green beans that you're growing for Walmart or Carrefour or Global Gap, which is the consortium of European supermarkets, and they have a specific standard and they want you to grow, and they give you the seeds often, and they want you to go grow exactly that cucumber that's just like that they all look the same in Whole Foods, it's done by a designer, right? That if they don't like it, that farmer is stuck with the green beans, which isn't going to be a whole lot better than being stuck with a whole field of roses. It's not better for the soil, it's not better for rural communities, it's not better for anything. But, I would argue, except getting certain kind of green beans in the supermarkets in France, which are growing. But if people are growing maize in the fields, if they are growing food crops on rooftops in the cities or in peri-urban farms, all of this is Nairobi, then the access is enhanced by knowledge, skill-intensive livelihoods, and people have work. They have good work producing good food that then becomes available locally. So, how do we recover from what's been lost in the past and move forward? What's my time here?
Oh, I hadn't even thought. I have 3 minutes till 8, but.
Okay,
keep
I'm
going.
getting
You're
to
over.
the end, I'm getting to the end, okay. So things that we need to lose. We need to lose an ideology inherited from 70 years ago, when food, coming out of 2 world wars and a depression in between, when a lot of people were hungry, but they didn't have any problem getting apples, they had trouble getting bread, and they certainly had trouble getting meat. That the idea that food was calories and proteins and getting enough of it to hungry people was what was needed. That's what informed absolutely every policy about agriculture and food. In fact, malnutrition had 2 kinds that don't even, well, they still apply today, but they don't cover the new problem today, which is the lack of micronutrients. It was protein malnutrition and calorie malnutrition. Now, they still exist, of course, and in some places they're growing. But the idea that you could not have enough vitamins and minerals just wasn't part of the picture. So all our policies were developed to create more grains and proteins, and they were fully subsidized, excluded from trade agreements, as I said, and produced an intensive livestock complex in which meat is artificially cheap and is full of uncounted costs. To health, we now know. To the environment, we certainly know. And to food security. Okay, so growing enough food, which was grains and animals, was measured in efficiency terms, which meant growing more of each of those per person or per unit of land, and that was a good thing. And that cities and the countryside were absolutely separate. Cities were not places you grow food. I remember being struck, Marjorie Cohen, who is, among other things, an economic historian, wrote a book about women's work in 19th century Ontario, which women's farming work in 19th century Ontario. And it's about dairy and the restructuring of dairy, and it's really, really a good book. But what I want to mention here is something that was in the appendix which I think she just put in because it was so interesting. I couldn't see the relation to the argument in the book, which was how many cows and chickens were in the city of Toronto, not just chickens, but cows, in 1890. I mean, it's quite incredible. So we have, now it's really hard to get the chickens back in, and we have a whole variety of zoning rules and health regulations and all kinds of things, some of which have some merit, some of which may have had merit at the time, but maybe don't have so much merit now because conditions have changed. All of that needs to be reconsidered. Just to know that this sharp divide between the countryside and the city, and the countryside was where food was grown, and that it was out of sight of the city, and that we could let it disappear across the face of the earth, or we could have our farmers exporting carrots to who knows where while the supermarkets are importing them here, which is what's happening right now in Toronto. That all those things could happen because cities were growing. They were growing through cars, they were paving over the countryside, which is the reason that they were there in the first place, because it was so fertile, is so fertile. And then they're just out of sight, out of mind, and we have no connection unless we reinvent it, which some people are. Now, oh yeah, I do have this whole other section, which I will just say, okay, there is a whole other tradition of understanding the relation between cities and food. Because cities grew up in relation to agriculture and in relation to their hinterlands. Except for the Roman Empire, that was mostly true. If you, in addition to this special rapporteur on the right to food, if you do anything else out of this lecture, I recommend that you read Carolyn Steele's book, Hungry City, How Food Shapes Our Lives. This is a map, I think it's from her, of London in 1676, and that big street through there, that's where they used to drive animals through. And the names are still there, Cheapside, Poultry Lane, Cornhill Street, and so on. The food was central. It was part of, in Mesopotamia, she does all that. It's part of temples, all of that. So, okay, what do we have now? We have cities with a broken metabolism to the food growing of the world and to all other things, flows of water, soil, air, that we now call often ecosystem services in a very anthropocentric way, but never mind, it's still an improvement over not recognizing them at all. So cities of the 19th century, and this is where I'm going to end, because there's so many things that we need to do to close these loops, to become aware of what we're doing and to do it well, to reconstruct the balance. Cities were not out of balance until the Industrial Revolution. Night soil is not something that's only from China. Night soil was being collected, Von Thunen, if you read him, it's really kind of fun, talks about the whole economy of bringing urban waste back out to the farms where it could be used again, which of course was jobs, which of course was nutrient cycling, instead of putting it into the ocean or the river or the lake. That when artificial fertilizer became possible, when fossil fuels changed a whole lot of things, we moved into a different world where the metabolism of the city started to become disrupted. Now, Marx had written in the 19th century about the metabolic rift between the city and the countryside, but it was really with the Industrial Revolution and with the use of fossil fuels in particular, which is why I dated it 70 years, that this rift began to happen, and that instead of cycling everything, there was no waste. Instead of cycling everything, we started to be able to just send it somewhere, which means it's going to pollute because no one's in charge of it, no one's even monitoring it. It means we bring stuff in, which means it's going to deplete for the same reason. So there's this is going to be my next project, and which is why I'm excited and putting it up now, I think, if I can do it. The metabolism of the Southern Ontario region. Like what's going in and what's going out, how has it changed historically, how could we start to close some of those loops now? It's all about a direction of movement. There's one of the most inspiring books I was reading today is by Sabine Bau called in French, I'll just translate it, the invention of waste in Paris. And it goes from 1790 to 1970. There was no waste in Paris at a certain point, and it got invented in the course of breaking these cycles. So this is still happening in India. Some of you may have seen that. People collect the cow pies, and they use them. If you're in a city like Varanasi, I haven't been there it may well have changed now. But when I was there maybe 15 years ago, the cows were there. The people, I had this little moment. This is really a paradigmatic moment for me. People were selling these little yogurt containers, individual containers with lovely yogurt in it. And it wasn't refrigerated, it was fresh. It was of the person who made the pot and the person who made the yogurt and the person who sold it. We're all in this networked economy. I bought it, I ate it, and I thought, those are so beautiful. I had an entrepreneurial moment. So people would throw them down, and of course they weren't finished. They would just dissolve back into the earth. They were just totally fine, just like they ate their street food on leaves. The animals would eat it, or whatever.
What was the container made of?
It was made out of clay, but not fired. So it would just disintegrate. That's what happened. I thought, these are so beautiful. I can bring them back to Canada and sell them, I bet, because nobody here even wants them. And so I decided to wash the yogurt out, and of course, by morning, I soaked it overnight, and by morning, it dissolved. I went, yes! But at the same time, there were plastic bottles, starting with tourists that were going on the ground. Now, animals can't eat them. Now people were collecting the plastic bottles. People are quite innovative, and maybe they were getting recycled. I hope so. But you can start to see how these little loops can get broken. Now, that doesn't mean we're supposed to go back to collecting cow pies, or even having lots of cows in the city. But we do have to think about certain things, and so I decided to take the most challenging, the most psychologically challenging, which is human waste. So in the 19th century, we developed this centralized system, sewers, to deal with the waste that was no longer being collected and taken to a place where it could actually help fertilize the soil, along with the animal waste. So that's what we did. We have these centralized systems, and then we have big processing plants that try to purify them, and then it goes somewhere, usually in the water. Now we also have big animal operations, and we spray the waste from that on big monocultural farms with complex effects. But there are other ways to do this. So John Todd, anyone familiar with him? The New Alchemy Institute, a couple of people, several people. It's really, it started in the 60s, I guess, maybe the 70s. John and Nancy Todd, and they developed living machines. There's a living machine at the Courtright Center. Go and look at it. He's doing it on a huge scale now. The Chinese government, like Brazil, China, is doing everything. It's doing all of the industrial stuff big time, and it's doing all of the sustainable stuff big time. They invited John Todd in to solve the problem that the London sewers were built to solve, which is how do you deal with all of the human waste that was going directly from pipes, so it's kind of blurry, you can't see it, going directly into these canals. They just are through the canals and river, it's going right through the city. And what he did was he built a living machine. He used plants, fish, snails, I don't know what he uses, it depends on the circumstance. He creates an ecosystem to manage and circulate that waste, and often to provide other amenities, which can be food, which can be urban parks, clean water. These are everywhere, these living machines, or the various aspects of them. This is, or could be, a future. And I think that was when I realized I was out of time. So that's the end of the lecture.